All right, we're now cutting live to these visuals coming in from Satish Dhawan Space Centre in Sriharikota in Andhra Pradesh in India, where India's first private orbital rocket, Vikram-1, is set to lift off. These are the visuals coming in from the Sriharikota in Andhra Pradesh in India. And of course, Vikram-1 is India's first privately built orbital rocket. It has been developed by Skyroot Aerospace. It's a Hyderabad-based space startup. Now, this is the first time an Indian private company is trying to launch a rocket into orbit from the Indian soil. Now, why is this mission so historic and important? It's because ISRO has launched rockets for decades, but now these private Indian companies are also building rockets. And if this launch is successful, India will be joining countries where private companies can independently launch satellites, similar to what SpaceX has done in the United States as well. Now, this mission is called Agman. Agman means arrival in Sanskrit, and it symbolizes the arrival of India's private space industry into the orbital launches. And talking more about this private, of course, company who is launching this mission, it's called Skyroot Aerospace. It was founded in 2018. Its headquarters is in Hyderabad. It was founded by former ISRO scientists, and the goal is to build affordable rockets for launching small satellites. Now, before Vikram-1, Skyroot had successfully launched Vikram-S, which is a suborbital rocket, in 2022, and that was India's first private rocket launched. Now, there's a difference between orbital rocket and a suborbital. Vikram-1 is an orbital rocket. Now, suborbital means when a rocket goes to space and it comes back. Meanwhile, orbital rocket, now that's that it goes so fast enough that it places satellites around Earth. And this company, Skyroot, is trying to test an orbital rocket with Vikram-1. And talking about Vikram-1, instead of one big satellite, this Vikram-1 is carrying multiple technology demonstration payloads and includes small satellites, space technology experiments, satellite components, future space hardware tests, and some payloads also include solid S3. And just to discuss more, we're going to our correspondent, Siddharth MP, was joining us from the location of this launch. Siddharth, tell us more about this. We know so much about this whole mission. Tell us why it's important for us.
As a country, India has had a space sector for the last 60 plus years, but the space sector has been dominated by the government, which is the Indian Space Research Organization. And now what we have is a private company designing, developing and building their own rocket, and that rocket today will be heading to space in barely 10 minutes from now. So that's what is significant. A private company is doing the unthinkable. Who knew that private companies in India could make rockets and launch them to space? And this is also being enabled by the Indian Space Research Organization, because the launch is happening from ISRO spaceport. It's happening from ISRO's launch pad. Typically, when we visit Sriharikota for news reportage, we often come for ISRO's launches. But this is the first time that we're visiting for an orbital rocket launch of a private company. And this is taking place from the first launch pad of ISRO, which is usually reserved for the PSLV or Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle launches that take place. Why this mission is significant is because this goes on to show how much Indian private space entities can do. And this also goes on to show that entrepreneurial ambition is getting wings, because the two founders of this particular company were engineers at ISRO about a decade ago or close to a decade ago. And at that time, they had this entrepreneurial zeal that why can't we make our own rockets? They were in fact making rockets for India, for ISRO. But they decided at one point that why can't we make rockets of our own and launch them? Later, the government policy also favored them and they had an opportunity to do so. And over the last 5-6 years, they've been working on this project. And now finally, it is a day of reckoning. And then they have this opportunity to fly that rocket to space and see how well it performs. So that is why this is significant, because globally, there are so many private companies that are involved in building and launching rockets and satellites. India did not have that until a handful of years ago. But now India has that, and Skyroot is among those companies that are really wanting to launch rockets to space. And this is also business, just like how there are cab operators that provide cabs to those in need, to passengers in need. Rocket operators can provide rockets to ferry satellites to space. If you have a satellite to send, you can just ring up the rocket company and say, I want a slot on your particular rocket, and then they can give you a slot and you can pay the price and you can send your satellite to space. So think of it like a ride-hailing model. So once you have a proven rocket which can take payloads to space reliably, then all you need is you just need to get in touch with these companies, and then it's possible to send your payload to space. Earlier it was only governments that were doing this, but now private companies in India are also doing this. So this shows the expanding of the sector, and this shows more opportunities. It means more jobs, more economic activity, more technological capability, and so on.
Right, and that's very interesting that you note down how it's going to be used by private companies to send these satellites. What we also know is that they're sending these different technologies, these multiple technologies, which include Solaris and Scope. What are these technologies, and what are these experiments that's going to be conducted by this launch?
So there are multiple technology demonstrators, as you pointed out. Three of them can be called as satellites because the others are more like symbolic payloads, including gold and diamonds and certain iconic figures of the Indian space program. Images of them will also be sent to space. Models of theirs will be sent to space. But as far as the satellites are concerned, there's going to be this very interesting experiment where a robotic arm will be tested in space, where it can try and capture space debris, because space debris is a growing international problem. Whoever wants to access space today faces the challenge of space debris. Space debris can damage rockets, they can damage satellites, they can cause a huge deal of problem. But what is the means to capture this debris? What is the means to clean up the space debris? That's what these robotic arms can perhaps do. So one of those robotic arms will be tested in this mission once it reaches space. Then, of course, the launching company itself, Skyroot, which built this rocket, Vikram-1, has their own satellite that they'll be sending to space to demonstrate certain technologies. So the reason why very high-end satellites or expensive satellites are not put on this rocket is a pretty technical and a fairly simple one as well. Usually when a rocket flies for the first time, it's an attempt, it's a test. It's not like a sure shot 100% success that one can expect from a first flight. There's always a bit of uncertainty because ultimately this is rocket science, which is why only demonstrators or payloads, smaller payloads, or let's say smaller satellites are sent rather than the huge expensive satellites. These are not satellites that will capture images of Earth, or these are not communication satellites. These are very small payloads that will do small experiments in space. The reason why this is being sent is because the rocket itself is being launched on an experimental basis. Therefore, what really counts at this point in time is that the satellites also go to space and perform some experiments. So that's the whole point, right? This mission itself is an experiment at a grand scale.
And also talking about this private company, Skyroot, it's fairly a new one. It was founded in 2018. And this is, of course, not the first mission they have done. They did a suborbital launch beforehand, and this is an orbital launch. What's the difference between these two launches then?
Yeah, so as you rightly pointed out, in traveling to space, there are multiple steps that a rocket has to follow. So if I were to quantify this as a distance that one has to walk or a distance that one has to drive or run, let me just start by saying that if one has to run a marathon of 42 kilometers, one would obviously have to start at 5 and 10 and then go do 21 and then eventually do 42. So nobody starts by running a 42-kilometer marathon straight away. You try and run 5 kilometers, you try and run 10, you perhaps do 21 and then do 42. It's a process, it's a gradual process, and that's how people progress. So rocket companies also do the same thing. So space is typically, or rather orbit is typically 400 kilometers above the Earth, but the boundary to space is about 100 kilometers. So what companies will do is, if they want to test something simple, they want to test something at a low cost fashion, what they would do is they would first fly to the boundary of space, which is 100 kilometers above the Earth, or about 80 to 100 kilometers above the Earth. That is what is called a suborbital flight. You basically do not cross space, you just remain within that imaginary boundary. And then you just see if your rocket's preliminary systems are functioning well, whether the rocket can cross the denser phase of the Earth's atmosphere, whether it can perform as designed. That is one part of the journey. So think of it like running the 10 kilometer and 21 kilometer run before doing a 42 kilometer marathon. And then today's space mission can be compared to a 42 kilometer marathon, where the rocket is going to the final destination, which is about 450 kilometers above Earth. And as you asked me about suborbital and orbit, suborbital essentially means it just goes up in a straight line and that's it. It doesn't put anything around Earth. But once something goes into orbit, it reaches a speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour. Average vehicles go at 100 kilometers per hour, and aircraft go at maybe 900 kilometers per hour. Fighter jets go at 2,000 kilometers per hour, but rockets go at 28,000 kilometers per hour. And of course, they have to travel 400 kilometers above the Earth. So you'll have to reach both of these parameters to put something into orbit. So that's what Skyroot is attempting today. 28,000 kilometers per hour in speed and 450 kilometers above the Earth. These are the two parameters they're looking to hit today.
Right, absolutely. And just for our viewers, of course, just to know that this mission is named after Dr. Vikram-1, who was the father of India's space program. That's why it's just so relevant at this point of time. Also, as you mentioned, that this since it's private, it's going to open the chances to other customers, and these include, of course, universities, startups, defense organizations. How are these different sectors going to benefit from this launch itself?
Typically, if you look at the global scenario, there are too many big rockets. There are private companies and governments that operate big rockets. Big rockets meaning rockets that can send anywhere between 1,000 kilograms to perhaps 20,000 or even 50,000 kilograms to space, or even maybe 60,000 kilograms to space. So there are large rockets. Think of them like trains or buses. But if you only have to take a short ride, you perhaps just need a bicycle or a two-wheeler, or you need a cab. So what if you could just send a small item on a small vehicle? That's more economical, right? That's where small rockets come into play. You don't need to send a small object on a massive truck. You just need to send a small object on a bike or perhaps on a smaller vehicle, right? That's where small rockets come in. For small satellites especially, small satellites perhaps cannot afford to wait for the larger rockets. So what they do is there is a unique category where there are small rockets that can cater especially to small satellites. So it's a very carefully considered business decision to cater to a niche market. So just like ride-hailing apps offer different options for vehicles, whether you want a rickshaw or whether you want a two-wheeler or whether you want a cab or whether you want an SUV or a sedan. Likewise, there are different types of rockets depending on size and depending on what it needs to carry. So more passengers, more heavier loads, heavier vehicle. Less passengers, lesser loads, smaller vehicle. So that's where small rockets fit in. And small satellites fit in, and small rockets also fit in, of course. And small satellites are typically built by universities, by small companies, by enthusiasts. So that's where this whole thing comes into play. There are microelectronics that are so affordable today, and technology is so accessible. So academia, schools, in fact, also can make small satellites. So for these satellites to fly to space, rockets like Skyroots perhaps would offer a low-cost solution to reach space rather than waiting for a larger rocket, which might perhaps be slightly more expensive.
Right, and that's very important because, of course, that's where the private companies come in and they start to give money into this discovery and the launches of such rockets. Siddharth, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, we'll be coming back to you as and when we see the launch happen. Thank you so much.